It was supposed to be a quiet evening, the kind you look forward to after a year of married life. Dinner at the small Italian place where they had their first date, a glass of red wine, a toast to surviving the first 12 months Nora Kemp had even picked out a dress weeks in advance. Her husband, Jared, seemed distracted lately, buried in deadlines and business travel. But she chalked it up to stress. Marriage wasn't a fairy tale, but it wasn't supposed to feel like this either. Earlier that week, Nora had gone in for a routine checkup. Just a physical, she told herself. It was Jared who pushed her, saying he didn't trust the online pharmacy that refilled her thyroid meds. So she went. She joked with the nurse about being overdue, laughed nervously when asked if she wanted the standard blood panel. "Sure, throw it all in," she said. 2 days later, she received a voicemail asking her to call the clinic. Not a message with results, a request. A chill settled into her stomach that wouldn't leave. On the afternoon of their anniversary, Nora sat in a sterile room with a counselor and a sealed folder on the desk. The counselor didn't waste time. "You've tested positive for HIV." The words sat in the air like a bullet before it hits. Nora blinked, opened her mouth, closed it again. "There's no way," she said. "There has to be a mistake. I've been with one person for over 3 years." The counselor didn't react, just offered her a box of tissues. "We'll do a confirmatory test today, but I need to ask, has your partner ever been tested?" Nora didn't answer. She stared at the floor and thought about the business trips. The nights he came home late, the password-protected laptop, the past 6 months that suddenly looked very different in the rearview mirror. She didn't go to dinner that night. Jared came home to find the apartment dark. The table was still set, the bottle of wine unopened. Nora was on the balcony, smoking, something he hadn't seen her do since college. "We need to talk," she said, not looking at him. Jared's eyes narrowed. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer, just stared straight ahead and said, "I tested positive." His face twitched, not in shock, not even confusion, but something Nora hadn't seen before. Contained, calculating. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. But she did. Even then, she knew the following morning, Nora returned to the clinic for the confirmatory test. She hadn't slept. Her mind replayed every moment with Jared that had ever felt off. Vague explanations, long business trips, the subtle ways he had pulled away from physical intimacy. She'd chalked it up to work stress. Now she wasn't so sure. Dr. Lin, a straight-talking infectious disease specialist, met her with clinical calm. "Your ELISA was positive. The Western blot confirmed it. I'm sorry, Nora. This isn't a lab error." Nora didn't cry. Instead, she asked questions. She needed to understand. How long could the virus stay dormant? Could she have had it for years without symptoms? Dr. Lin explained the window period, the likelihood of transmission, and gently added, "If your husband is your only partner in the past few years, then you may want to ask if he's willing to be tested as well." But Nora knew already. In her gut, the truth was sinking in like acid. She left the clinic and drove aimlessly for hours, eventually parking outside Jared's office. It was after 6, but his car was still there. She waited. At 7:43 p.m., she saw him exit the building, not alone. A woman trailed him, laughing. Younger, maybe 24. They hugged not in a way coworkers did, but in a way that told stories behind closed doors. Nora didn't follow. She just watched, then drove home in silence. At midnight, Jared returned. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the lights off. "You didn't answer my texts," he said, loosening his tie. "I thought we were past that conversation." Nora spoke slowly. "You need to get tested, tomorrow." Jared stared at her. "You think this is my fault?" "I know it is." His expression changed, not guilt, but fear masked as anger. "You want to start accusing me now? Maybe you haven't been as faithful as you think." Nora laughed once, cold, short. "That's what you're going with?" Jared stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. That night, she began digging. Passwords, emails, phone records. She remembered enough to guess some of his logins. What she found was not a single affair, but multiple. Messages dating back over a year, some explicit, some emotional. Names she didn't recognize. One stood out. K. They had exchanged dozens of emails. They had met in hotels. One message, dated 4 months ago, chilled her. You should get tested, I'm serious. It came back positive for me. The message hadn't even been opened. The next morning, Nora called in sick. She sat on the edge of their bed, Jared's laptop on her lap, her fingers trembling. She had barely slept. Rage was beginning to settle beneath the shock, no longer hot but cold and calculating. Every response she read from Jared, flirty, callous, even manipulative, drained another piece of the man she thought she'd married. She went back to the emails. K.A. had used a burner Gmail account. No real name, no phone number, just cryptic signatures. K, or occasionally Cat. She had attached a lab form once, but it was a blurry scan. Nora downloaded it, zoomed in, and finally saw it, a name, smudged but legible, Catherine Arliss. The name meant nothing to her. Nora copied it, pasted it into a search bar, and added LinkedIn. 3 profiles came up. One of them listed a consulting firm, Albright Stratagems, the same firm Jared had worked with last summer during a merger campaign. Nora opened the profile, blonde, 32, based in Chicago. The dates matched. She found Catherine's company email in a press release from a year ago. Nora didn't hesitate. She typed a message that read like a ceasefire. I need to speak to you. I think you know why. She hit send and waited. Catherine replied 6 hours later, I shouldn't be talking to you. This could ruin a lot of things. Nora replied, It already has. They met in a public park, halfway between their apartments. Catherine was dressed in oversized sunglasses and a scarf, like she was meeting a blackmailer. She barely looked at Nora at first. I don't know what you want me to say, Catherine muttered. I told him, I was clear. Nora's voice was even. You tested positive. Yes, early June. I told Jared immediately. I never heard back. I assumed. She stopped. You assumed what? Nora's throat tightened. I assumed he told you, or did something. But when I heard nothing, I thought maybe it wasn't mine. Maybe I'd made a mistake. You didn't. Nora held her gaze. I tested positive last week. Catherine's face went pale. Her lips parted, then shut. Her voice cracked when she said, I'm sorry, I swear I didn't know he never told you. He didn't even open the message. They sat in silence, the air between them heavy. Catherine finally whispered, You should talk to his ex, Melanie. Who's Melanie? She's the one who warned me. Said Jared lies, that he's not who he says he is. Nora tracked Melanie down in less than a day. The name Melanie Foster came up in a series of archived corporate event photos Jared had saved on an old cloud account. She wasn't tagged, but Nora recognized her face from one of the emails. Mel, the one Jared had once called, a phase I should have outgrown sooner. A basic search revealed Melanie's address, a modest bungalow in Evanston. The place was quiet, tucked behind a row of maple trees already shedding for fall. Nora didn't call first. She needed to see Melanie in person, to know if the voice behind the warnings matched the storm in her gut. Melanie opened the door cautiously, dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt, holding a toddler on her hip. She blinked when she saw Nora. You're not delivering anything, are you? I'm Jared's wife. Melanie's face changed. Not surprise, recognition, maybe even regret. She stepped outside and pulled the door behind her. How long have you known? A week, Nora said. I tested positive. Catherine told me you warned her. Melanie looked away. I did. Why? Because I lived it, she said. He told me he was clean, told me he'd gotten tested before we moved in together. I found out he never had. Nora's stomach twisted. Were you? No, I was lucky. I made him get tested after I found condoms in his car. He stalled, delayed, claimed work stress. When I pushed harder, he lashed out. Said I was being paranoid, jealous. I left him 6 months later. Never got an apology. Never got closure. Did he know? Melanie exhaled. I'll say this carefully. He never admitted anything. But when I told him Catherine had messaged me and that she'd tested positive, his response wasn't shock. It was damage control. He begged me not to tell anyone. Not her, not HR, not the partners. Said it would ruin him. Did he get tested? He claimed he did. Showed me a form. But it was cropped. I don't even know if it was his. Do you think he knew he was positive? Melanie paused, then said, I think he gambled. And you lost. The words hit like ice water. Nora stood there, frozen, the world narrowing to a point behind her eyes. She was already thinking past the conversation. She needed proof, real proof. "You should talk to his doctor," Melanie said before Nora left. "If he even has one." Nora didn't reply, but as she drove home, a quiet fury rose inside her. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad luck. It was betrayal with a body count. Nora began with what she could access: insurance records. Jared's employer used a large healthcare provider, so she logged into the shared account and searched under his name. The last annual physical listed was from nearly 3 years ago. After that, nothing. No prescriptions, no lab requests, no HIV panel. She dug deeper, calling the provider under the pretense of checking eligibility for her husband's upcoming appointment. The woman on the line hesitated. "He hasn't seen anyone through us since 2020, she said. "If he was tested, it wasn't through our network." That night, while Jared slept, Nora returned to the emails. She searched for terms like clinic, urgent care, lab results. One chain came up from a personal email thread, a payment confirmation from a private concierge health service called Norwell Diagnostics. It was vague, just a line item. Comprehensive STD panel, $600. The date? July 3rd. She wrote down the address and showed up the next morning with a worn tote bag and an old hoodie. The receptionist looked up at her with blank politeness. "I'm here to get a copy of my husband's results," Nora said. "Jared Kemp, July 3rd. "We can't release medical records without patient consent," the receptionist replied, almost rehearsed. Nora nodded. "Right, of course. He just told me to pick them up. He said they'd be ready." The woman hesitated, typing. "Do you have an ID?" "I left it in the car, but he said it was under both our names. He mentioned I'd be authorized." It was flimsy. She knew it. The receptionist frowned. "Let me check with the doctor." 10 minutes passed. When she returned, her tone was firmer. "I'm sorry, we can't give you anything without a release form signed by Mr. Kemp. You'll have to have him call us directly." Nora left with nothing but confirmation. Jared had been tested. That was real. But whether he had ever seen the results, acknowledged them, or acted on them, that remained hidden. Back at home, she stared at him from across the kitchen counter as he scrolled through his phone. Her chest was tight. "Did you ever get tested this year?" she asked suddenly. Jared didn't even flinch. "I don't remember. Maybe back in spring." "Where?" "I don't know. Someplace downtown." She nodded slowly, forcing calm. "Did they send you results?" He shrugged. "Probably. I never checked those emails." He lied so easily it terrified her. The next step was harder. Nora couldn't access Jared's records legally without his signature, and there was no guarantee a lawyer would take her case based on suspicion alone. She needed leverage. The idea came at 3 a.m., while staring at the ceiling in the dark. Jared used DocuSign for work. His inbox was littered with contracts, some internal, some external. She'd watched him do it dozens of times. It wasn't hard to forge, just his name and an auto-generated scribble. By noon, she had drafted a clean, professional release form, downloaded directly from Norwell's website. Jared's signature was pasted in neatly. She sent it from his account to the clinic with a polite note. An hour later, a PDF arrived. She read the first page once, then again, and a third time. On July 3rd, Jared had tested positive for HIV-1 antibodies. He had also tested positive for HSV-2 and elevated liver enzymes. The report was stamped, delivered, July 4th, 10:08 a.m. It was marked, reviewed by patient portal access. He had read it. She wasn't even a theory anymore. He had known. She sat on the floor for nearly an hour, arms wrapped around her knees. There wasn't even sadness anymore, just disbelief. Just a quiet war in her chest between fury and numbness. He came home that night whistling. She watched him unpack takeout. His hands touched every surface casually, like they weren't stained with the things she now knew. Nora stood in the hallway. "I know you got the results." Jared turned. "What?" "Norwell. July 3rd. I have the report." He froze, eyes narrowing, calculating. "You broke into my email?" "I forged your consent." There was a long pause. Then you're a criminal too, he said flatly, turning back to the food. You've exposed me to a virus that will change the rest of my life. It was a mistake, he muttered. I didn't think it would happen to you. Nora walked forward, voice shaking. You didn't think. You didn't care. You read that report and did nothing. You didn't warn me. You didn't stop. You're not going to make this into some court drama, he snapped. Do you think anyone's going to believe you if you admit to illegally accessing my records? He turned, stepping close. You don't want to do this. You want to stay married. You want to pretend it never happened. That's the best outcome for both of us. He walked past her. She stood still, the air burning in her lungs. She no longer cared about marriage. She cared about making him pay. The next morning, Nora called the county health department. She disguised her voice as calm but firm. She explained she had been diagnosed with HIV, that she had reason to believe her spouse knew he was positive before transmitting it to her. The woman on the phone was professional. We have protocols, she said. It's called partner notification. We can contact partners anonymously. But if you believe he intentionally exposed you without disclosure, that's criminal. You'll need to file a report. What happens then? Nora asked. If we find probable cause, the case is referred to the district attorney. Nora hung up with a shaking hand. She wasn't just contemplating divorce anymore. She was contemplating turning Jared into a defendant, watching him sit in court, squirming, watching him answer to a judge. But the idea also terrified her. Jared wasn't the type to go quietly. That afternoon, she sent anonymous messages from a burner email to several of the women Jared had corresponded with. Names she recognized from the emails she'd found. Short messages. Clinical. You may have been exposed to HIV. Recommend testing immediately. Jared Kemp. Within hours, 2 replied. One was furious, disbelieving. The other, a woman named Tessa, responded almost too quickly. I'm already positive. Nora stared at the screen for a long time. She asked one question. Did Jared know? Tessa's answer came in 3 short words. He always knew. Nora's stomach twisted. This wasn't carelessness. It was a pattern, a deliberate trail of damage. When Jared came home that evening, she pretended nothing had changed. She cooked dinner. She watched TV beside him. She even laughed at a stupid movie. Inside, she was elsewhere, planning. She spent the night compiling everything she had. The test result, the emails, Catherine's message, Melanie's warnings, Tessa's confirmation, a case file, like something a detective might put together. It wasn't just for the authorities. It was for herself. Proof that when she finally made her move, no one could claim she hadn't been justified. Proof that she was no longer a victim waiting for permission to fight back. It didn't take long for Jared to notice 2 days after Nora's anonymous messages went out. The atmosphere in the apartment shifted. Jared's phone buzzed constantly. His temper grew brittle, snapping at minor inconveniences. Misplaced keys, a cold coffee, a parking ticket. Nora watched him from across the room. Jared wasn't confused. He wasn't afraid of what he didn't know. He was afraid of what he couldn't control. On Friday evening, Jared came home late, reeking of cigarettes and whiskey. He threw his keys onto the counter hard enough to leave a mark. You think you're smart? He slurred. Nora didn't answer. You think you're going to ruin me? He said louder. Still, she said nothing. He slammed his hands on the kitchen table, rattling the cheap glass centerpiece. You're not going to court. You're not going to the police. You're going to shut your mouth, and we're going to move past this. She met his gaze finally, cold and even. You're scared. His face twisted. Not guilt, but hatred. You do anything, Jared said, voice low and shaking, and you'll regret it. He went to the bedroom, slamming the door hard enough to shake the walls. Nora stood there, staring at the vibrating table, the silence thick as cement. It was no longer about the infection, no longer about the betrayal. It was about survival. The next morning, she packed a suitcase and left. She didn't leave a note, didn't text. She checked into a cheap motel outside town under a fake name. She slept with the dresser pushed against the door and the TV on mute, the room buzzing faintly with static. On Sunday, she met with a detective from the county's Special Victims Unit. Detective Rivera listened carefully as Nora laid everything out. The emails, the test results, the testimonies from Catherine, Melanie, and Tessa. At the end, Rivera exhaled heavily. "This isn't just civil," she said. "Knowingly exposing someone to HIV without disclosure is a felony here. We can open a case, but you need to understand, once we start, there's no pulling back." "I'm not pulling back," Nora said. She filed the official complaint that afternoon. Back at the motel, her phone lit up with an unknown number. A message blinked across the screen. "You're going to regret this." No name, no signature. But Nora didn't need one. The days after filing the complaint passed in slow, shallow breaths. Nora barely slept. She kept the TV muted, one ear always tuned to the hallway outside her motel room. Detective Rivera called twice to reassure her the case was active, but the tone of her voice was careful, cautious, the way people spoke when they couldn't promise protection. The restraining order was submitted, but it would take time. Everything took time. Nora knew Jared wasn't waiting. 2 days after the complaint, the motel's front desk clerk called her room. "Ma'am, there's a man asking for you," he said. "Said he's your husband." Her blood ran cold. "Tell him there's no one here by that name, and don't let him in." She hung up and started packing before she even thought about it. She shoved her things into a bag, heart hammering, hands trembling. She knew how Jared thought: control first, violence second if needed. She slipped out the back exit, ducking behind parked cars until she reached her rental. She drove aimlessly for 2 hours before pulling into a Walmart parking lot, turning off the engine and slumping against the seat, breathless. Later that night, she received another text. "You can't run forever." This time, the fear twisted into something sharper: rage. Nora was done running. She checked into another motel, cash only, a county away. From there, she called Catherine and Tessa, asking if they'd be willing to talk to the detectives. Both women agreed. Tessa, especially, seemed energized, almost relieved to have someone else finally pushing back. "The more voices, the stronger the case," Rivera said when Nora updated her. Still, there was no arrest. Jared hadn't been served yet. They were building probable cause, threading together witness statements, medical reports, digital records. Jared wasn't stupid. Nora knew he could feel it, the invisible noose tightening day by day. On the third night, she dreamt she was back in their apartment, the front door swinging open, Jared standing there expressionless, holding something heavy and gleaming in his hand. She woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, the cheap motel sheets twisted around her ankles. It wasn't just a dream, it was a warning. She knew. He wouldn't let this end in a courtroom if he could help it. Nora began to feel the squeeze, a creeping paranoia that wasn't just paranoia anymore. 2 days after relocating, she noticed a white sedan lingering across the motel's parking lot. It was there when she went to get coffee. It was there when she returned. A man sat inside, obscured by a ball cap and sunglasses. She told herself it could be coincidence. She didn't believe it. She called Rivera. "I think I'm being watched." "Can you describe the vehicle?" "White, 4-door, no plates." "Stay inside," Rivera said sharply. "We're escalating the request for an emergency protective order. If he's violating it before it's served, that strengthens our case." But paper protections wouldn't stop what Jared was planning. Nora could feel it, the certainty that he had moved beyond threats. That night, someone pounded on her door. 1, 2, 3 hard knocks. She didn't answer. She pressed her back against the wall, heart pounding so loud she thought it might give her away. A voice slithered through the door. "Open up, Nora. Let's talk." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. She recognized the voice immediately. She didn't breathe, didn't move. The knocking stopped after a few minutes, but she didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she checked out, paid cash, and drove east without a destination, her rental car a speeding blur across county lines. Meanwhile, Rivera filed for an emergency warrant. Tessa and Catherine's affidavits had been reviewed. Melanie had agreed to submit her statement too. 3 women, independent of each other, all telling the same story. Jared Kemp knew he was HIV positive, hid it, and continued to engage in unprotected sexual relationships. The legal wheels were grinding into motion, but slowly. Too slowly. Nora pulled into a rural roadside inn, the kind without digital check-ins, and paid in cash again. She used a fake name this time, Marie Daniels. She checked the locks twice. She kept a steak knife under her pillow. She moved the dresser in front of the door again. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was preparing. She knew Jared would find her eventually. He was too methodical, too prideful, to let her slip away without confrontation. And when that happened, she would no longer be the woman begging for justice. She would be the woman fighting for her life. It happened on a Thursday evening. Nora had been at the roadside inn for 3 days, rarely leaving her room except to grab food from the gas station 2 miles down the road. She moved like prey in open fields, never taking the same route twice. She kept the curtains drawn, lights dim, eyes constantly flicking to the parking lot. She was folding clothes, such a normal, useless thing to be doing, when she heard the creak. The wrong kind of creak. The sound of a doorframe flexing under pressure. She froze. Her hand gripped the knife tucked under the mattress. Another sound. The soft scrape of a shoe on cheap carpet. Nora moved silently, heart pounding so hard it filled her ears with white noise. She crouched behind the bed, the knife trembling in her hand. The door handle twitched. She hadn't imagined it. A second later, it burst inward with a crack of splintered wood. Jared stormed in, red-faced, sweat slicked, eyes wide with rage and something else, desperation. "There you are," he snarled. He crossed the room in 3 long strides before she could even scream. He grabbed her by the wrist, wrenching the knife free and sending it clattering across the floor. "You think you can destroy my life?" Jared roared. Nora struggled, kicking, scratching. His grip tightened around her arm, brutal enough to leave bruises. He threw her against the bed. She scrambled back, but he was on her, pinning her wrists, his weight crushing the air out of her lungs. "You want to play victim?" Jared spat. "You think you're innocent?" He was shouting now, words tumbling over each other, a mixture of blame and madness. His free hand fumbled toward his waistband. For a sickening second, Nora thought he had a weapon, a gun, a knife. But it was just his fist, raised to strike. Somewhere deep inside, something snapped. Nora jerked her knee upward, hard, catching him square in the ribs. He gasped, his grip loosened just enough. She twisted free, grabbing the nearest object, the motel's heavy lamp, and swung with everything she had. The base connected with a sickening thud. Jared staggered back, blood running from a gash above his eyebrow. He blinked, dazed, fury boiling. Nora didn't stop. She swung again, and again. Jared fell backward, hitting the cheap dresser with a crack. He slumped to the floor, groaning. She dropped the lamp. Her hands were slick with sweat and something darker. Gasping, shaking, Nora backed away toward the door. Sirens, faint at first, then growing louder. Through the smashed doorframe, she saw flashing red and blue lights flooding the parking lot. For the first time in weeks, she let herself breathe. The cavalry had finally arrived. The world after the attack moved in slow frames. Flashing lights painted the walls red and blue. Uniformed officers stormed the room, guns drawn, shouting orders Nora barely registered. She raised trembling hands and fell to her knees on the threadbare carpet. He broke in," she gasped. "He tried to kill me." 2 officers handcuffed her carefully, more out of procedure than suspicion, while a third leaned over Jared's still body. "He's breathing," the officer called out. Paramedics rushed in minutes later. Jared was semi-conscious, groaning incoherently, blood matting his hair. He was strapped onto a gurney and wheeled out under heavy guard. Detective Rivera arrived shortly after, her face grim. She pulled Nora aside gently, away from the uniformed chaos. "I need you to walk me through everything," Rivera said. Nora spoke in a low, broken voice, recounting every detail: the forced door, the physical assault, the threats, the struggle. Rivera listened carefully, nodding, occasionally asking quiet, focused questions. Body cam footage from the first responding officers captured the broken lock, the forced entry, the blood on Nora's wrists and clothes. The desk clerk confirmed Jared had been seen circling the motel earlier that afternoon. Nora's bruised wrists and the injuries on Jared aligned with her story. "This was self-defense," Rivera said at last. But you're going to need a lawyer. This isn't over yet. At the hospital, Jared was stabilized but remained under armed watch. Charges against him were being finalized: felony assault, stalking, criminal transmission of HIV, and now, attempted homicide. Despite everything, Nora wasn't celebrating. Sitting in the sterile police interview room, wrapped in a scratchy blanket, she felt hollow. The man she had married had transformed before her eyes into a predator, and she had survived, but at a cost she hadn't fully measured yet. Detective Rivera handed Nora a bottle of water and sat across from her. "You did everything right," Rivera said quietly. "You fought for your life. Don't let him take anything else from you." Nora nodded slowly, but the weight inside her didn't lift. Outside the precinct, reporters were already gathering, chasing rumors. They didn't know the whole story yet, but they would. The case would go public. Jared's polished facade would collapse, his affairs, his lies, his crimes, all dragged into the light. But with it would come judgment, whispers, headlines, husband, wife, betrayal, blood. Nora wasn't sure yet if she would be seen as a survivor or just another cautionary tale. The first headline hit 2 days after Jared's arrest. Local executive charged with felony assault and HIV exposure. By the end of the week, the story had gone national. Journalists circled like vultures. Old photos of Nora and Jared, smiling on their wedding day, flooded the news cycle, contrasted cruelly against grainy mugshots and whispered speculations. Reporters staked out the courthouse. Commentators dissected every detail: the emails, the diagnosis, the violent confrontation. Half painted Nora as a tragic heroine. Others, predictably, asked the sickening question: what did she do to provoke him? Nora avoided it all. She changed her phone number. She stayed with an old college friend out of town who offered her a couch and the safety of anonymity. Still, she felt exposed, raw, stripped of any illusion that justice would come cleanly. Jared's legal team moved quickly, trying to spin the narrative. Temporary insanity, marital disputes, claims that Nora exaggerated or fabricated threats. But the evidence was solid. Rivera's team had the forced entry photos, the threatening messages, the testimonies from Catherine, Tessa, and Melanie. The district attorney announced they would pursue maximum charges. Jared was formally indicted. Attempted murder, 2nd degree, aggravated assault, stalking, criminal transmission of HIV. Breaking and entering in total, he faced up to 75 years if convicted. Still, court would be its own battlefield. Nora knew it the moment Rivera sat her down with a victim advocate. "You're going to have to testify," the advocate said gently. "It's going to be brutal. His lawyers will tear apart everything you say." Nora nodded. She was tired of being silent. Meanwhile, a civil attorney contacted her, encouraging her to file a separate lawsuit for damages. "You have a strong case for intentional infliction of emotional distress," he said. "Medical costs, pain, and suffering. Future lost income. You deserve compensation." But Nora hesitated. Money felt meaningless. Nothing could undo what had been taken from her. And yet, another part of her, colder now, sharper, saw it differently. Jared had spent years stealing other people's futures. Maybe it was time to take something back. In the background, more women began contacting authorities. A former co-worker, a casual fling, a neighbor from his old apartment complex. None of them had known. None had been warned. Jared wasn't an isolated incident. He was a plague. The more victims who spoke, the stronger the case grew. Jared's empire of silence was collapsing, not in a whisper, but a roar. Nora wasn't naive. She knew the trial would break her all over again. But this time, she would walk into that courtroom armed with something Jared had never expected her to have: the truth, and the will to survive it. The courtroom was colder than Nora expected. Not in temperature, but in tone. Polished, indifferent, clinical. Like her life, and the lives of Jared's other victims, were just data points to be argued over. When Jared was wheeled into the courtroom, the scars from the motel struggle still visible across his forehead, Nora forced herself to look at him. He didn't meet her eyes. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, a ghost of the man she had once loved, or thought she had. The trial stretched over 2 exhausting weeks. Prosecutors built their case meticulously. Nora's testimony, raw but controlled. Catherine and Tessa's sworn statements. Melanie's warnings from years before. Forensic evidence from the motel crime scene. Medical reports confirming Jared's diagnosis and pattern of deception. The defense tried to paint Jared as reckless but not malicious, arguing that he had been in denial about his diagnosis, that Nora's injuries were minor compared to the media circus she orchestrated, that she was milking victimhood for sympathy. Nora sat through it all, steady but hollow inside. The hardest part wasn't describing the attack. It was hearing strangers debate whether her life-altering diagnosis, the medication she would take daily, the fear stitched into her future relationships, was somehow her fault for not leaving earlier, for trusting the wrong person. But she stayed. She sat tall. She answered every question. And when the closing arguments finished and the jury filed out, Nora felt a strange calm settle over her. There was nothing more to give. The verdict came back after 2 hours. Guilty, on all counts. Jared sat rigid as the sentences were read out. The judge, unflinching, handed down a cumulative sentence of 68 years, no possibility of parole for the first 40. It was over. Almost. Nora also filed a civil suit. Quietly, privately. It wasn't about money, though she accepted the settlement that followed, enough to cover therapy, medical expenses, and the pieces of a life she was still learning to rebuild. Reporters chased her for interviews. Book deals were hinted at. But she declined every offer. Fame wasn't the closure she wanted. One morning, 6 months later, she sat alone in a small park, watching the early mist lift from the grass. She sipped her coffee slowly, feeling, not happiness exactly, but something sturdier, endurance. Jared would never touch her again. He would never touch anyone else again. And she had survived. Changed, scarred, but still here. At the edge of her old life, Nora had found a new truth. Survival wasn't the absence of pain. It was the decision every day to live anyway.